We're making education, families, and America great again. Here's Ray.
Well, welcome to Ray Moore Live and September 10th. I've got my wife on again this morning, and we're glad to have her while she can be available during these last 6 months of the year. She's available a good bit to be on the program with me on Tuesdays. And today we're going to just deal with something very mundane and ordinary. We're going to talk about work, labor, work, and the importance of work. And we are a week behind, or actually more than a week behind Labor Day now. And we do have one weekend a year that we celebrate work or Labor Day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing. It's not like Christmas or Easter or even Thanksgiving, but it's an important thing to be reminded of. And particularly Christians need to be good at their work. Every able-bodied Christian is to work in some way. It's a means of providing a living, to look after their families, and to bless others in need, and to provide for the church and for missionary work. There are many purposes for work. Even women under 60 are to be homemakers or to be working. And there's a whole chapter in 1 Timothy talking about widows and widows indeed. And now some people may not be able to work because of being very aged or infirmities or disabilities. And these people are to be supported by their families, but we're going
or by the church if there's no family.
Right, that's right. If they have no families, and we actually have a situation like that right now in our church, where two single women are very aged and failing in health. One is failing in health, and our churches they couldn't even be widows indeed, according to 1 Timothy, because they have no family. So we've become their family. Mm-hmm. And so God has provisions for work. Okay, so let's look at some of the texts where work first shows up in the Bible. Actually, it shows up in Genesis 1:27-30. Mm-hmm. God created man in his own image, and he blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." This means that they're to have children. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and every living thing. And then verse 29-30, we see that he ordained work before the fall. So the fact that we have to work hard work was ordained before the fall, and after the fall, we see in Genesis 3:16-19 that work was made much more difficult. Mm-hmm. Was it that we shouldn't work before the fall, but after the fall, it was made much more difficult. And we can see that in verse 16, the woman says, "I will multiply your sorrow and conception, and in pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Then to Adam he said, "Because you heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat of the herb of the field, and the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground." So it wasn't that we weren't to work in the garden, but after the fall, it's made much more difficult. Okay, so these are some of the early texts of Scripture that deal with work.
And we might look now and think about this, that work was really a gift that God gave to Adam and Eve. If you think about when he first gave Adam very important work, the naming of all the animals and the care of the entire earth. We think often these days, especially, about Christians being stewards, a man being a steward of the earth. And it is God who made man steward of the earth. It wasn't man's decision to steward the earth and to take care of it. We have that concept promulgated today that man needs to be responsible for this. Well, God made man responsible for it. So yes, indeed, it is our work.
Okay. We mentioned already, say 4 or 5 of the purposes, but first of all, to make a living, that is to provide for your own family. And a lot of the commands about work in the Bible are actually negative commands. It's work is sort of assumed. So there's a lot of warnings against being a sluggard, against laziness, against idleness, and quite a few texts like that. Let's go back and pick up Exodus 28 and 9. This is where God says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall work or labor and do all your work in 6 days. So here's the command, at least one day is to be set aside for rest. We're not to be totally consumed in our work, but we're to set aside one day for rest, and we also use it for worship. And we call that the Lord's Day or Sunday. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. Let's look at John 5:17. Mm-hmm. Jesus reminds us in the New Testament, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are also working. So God works. So if he works, we should work as well. Okay, let's see a few more.
He's made that a type of blessing. He's put his stamp of approval on it in a big way. It says that they have been working. And of course, it means they're working for our good and for our benefit and for God's glory. And we should be doing the same thing. We benefit from our work, and we should be giving God glory. And that's a concept that's being very lost today, is a concept that you honor God when you work the way you're supposed to work.
All right, let's look at Ephesians 4:28. I don't believe I gave that one to you, Jared, but it shows here that when we work and we accumulate funds or wealth, we can bless others. So here's a admonition, says, let him who stole no longer steal, but rather let him labor, let him work, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who is in need.
This is an interesting passage. Today we have a concept that if people are sinning, they should be brought willy-nilly into the church fellowship in any concept. Well, we know if someone has a proclivity to murder or to steal, they shouldn't be in good fellowship in a church. We would want to encourage them, as Paul did here. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good. So we have in the New Testament the concept of putting off sin and putting on righteous actions. And so that's the concept that's being put forth here by Paul in Ephesians. Let him who stole steal no longer. Don't do this, but now do this, but rather let him labor. It's interesting, when children are born, they come to us, with a clean slate pretty much. They are, of course, sinners because of Adam, right?
Right.
Right there. Okay. But they come without any preconceived ideas about what they're supposed to do. But you watch children as they grow, they love imitating adults. They know that they are in training, as it were, to become adults. And so they want to follow you around and do what you do. And so if they see a mother washing dishes or a dad washing the car, there's nothing they would rather get out there and do than help the dad wash the car. My point is, they come loving work. And somewhere along the line, Western society has made people think that working is not a good thing. but it is really a grace gift that God has given to us. And so it's a good thing. Look what this verse says, working with his hands what is good, that he has something to give him who has need. Boy, the Lord told us it's more blessed to give than to receive. And if you've never given a gift, you can't know the meaning of this. But on Christmas Day, even, don't you love to see people open your gift to them? That's just such a very special thing.
Let's look at a minute at the sin of refusing to work. And one text for that would be 1 Timothy 5:8, where it says, not providing for your family is worse than an infidel. And this primarily looks at not taking care of your widowed mother, I guess, but the principle is still true in any area of life. We have to provide for our own, and that probably means your own family. And it says you've denied the faith, and worse than an unbeliever. So working is a godly thing, and not working is sinful. It is disobedient to refuse to work. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Let's look at that one real quick. This whole section here, it says, we commanded you this. This is when Paul was with them. Remember when he was an apostle with the Thessalonians, he actually worked, even though he as a servant of the Lord was entitled not to work. He could live on the offerings, I guess, of the flock, but he chose not to do it so that he could set an example for the Thessalonians. He said, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither should he eat. So this is a pretty strong command, that being lazy and being a sluggard, I don't know that we would do that, but our society today, through the welfare system, basically sets up people in programs where they don't have to work and they can just be sluggards and lazy and, have many children and out of wedlock because they get more money from the state if they do that. So even many of our government programs contribute to laziness and lack of work. But the Christian teaching is if you don't work, you shouldn't be eating either. And
you want to talk about John Smith here?
Yeah. Gail's going to bring in a story from early American history. Can you set the context up for that too?
Yes. When the settlers landed at Jamestown,
1607,
John Smith was elected their he was Captain John Smith, and he was kind of, I don't know what title he was given, but he was like a president of the community, someone who directed. He
might have been governor, but I'm just not 100% sure of his title, but he was sort of in charge.
Well, it says he was a colonial governor. And when they landed, this is the principle that John Smith set forward. And as a matter of fact, a lot of American historians believe that John Smith was the first to promulgate this idea. It was a biblical concept. He actually used the verse, he that will not work shall not eat. And that's right out of 2 Thessalonians 3:10. This is a principle on which this was set up. Now, here's the reason for this. This group of settlers, some were gentry from England, and gentry were the people who had large estates and owned large fields, and they hired people to work the fields, and they received the blessings of the produce on that field and sold it and ate from it. And they weren't used to working with their hands. And so that's the reason, I believe the first year, there was not enough food. The gentry would not work. They were expecting other people to work on their behalf, and they would direct them. And so John Smith said, you want to eat, you got to work.
Yeah, and let me add one thing. The early settlers at Jamestown, and this was in 1607, was a kind of a mixed group. It was a kind of an evangelistic missionary enterprise, but as Gail mentioned, the gentry, these were the second and third sons of very wealthy English families. And in that day, the oldest child or the oldest son would inherit the estate.
It's actually the law of primogeniture.
And so these second and third sons grew up in privilege and in wealth and had grown up not really working so much. They just sort of let the servants do all the work. And so one way that the English government took care of them to compensate them for their lack of an inheritance in their own family estates back in England, they gave them an inheritance, so to speak, or some new land in the New World. Well, they got over there, but they didn't have the servants with them. They had to actually work, and they were not used to it. They were privileged people. And this is why John Smith, set this rule down. And so this was a founding principle of the first colony, the first English colony. And we've always had that principle. We were founded on a free market. I wanted to mention also, looking back, one of the reasons to work is that you gain wealth, or we could say capital. And that's seen in Proverbs 23:4. Take a look at that. If you have a wealth, you can use it for purposes. You can reinvest it, and this is what capitalism is, or a building up of wealth. You build up wealth, and then you can invest it back into a business or into an enterprise. Actually, it's the wrong text. I'm sorry. That talks about wealth evaporating. But one of the reasons is to increase wealth. That's Proverbs 13:11. I got the wrong text there. Sorry. 13:11. Wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. So this looks at gaining wealth or capital by labor. And this is what the United States, America, was built on, an entrepreneurial approach. People making their way, earning their way, building up small businesses that turn into big businesses eventually. And then they can hopefully and prayerfully use their wealth to the advantage of God's kingdom. Now, today we have a lot of wealthy people who are not Christians, and so they don't invest their wealth in God's kingdom, but this is his design.
I want to say one thing here is that this is such an ingrained concept in American thinking that when a young person goes to college, we don't think anything. If they go, they may be going to study engineering or even philosophy or some great science. When that person's in college, they might take a job waiting tables in a restaurant or flipping hamburgers at a McDonald's or working at a car wash. But I had a friend when Ray was in seminary who had come from another country and thought it was the funniest thing to see men who had college degrees and were working on graduate degrees in seminary working with their hands. Just thought that was peculiar, but it's an American thing. And, other cultures won't allow people to work if they're of a certain, for example, in Hindu cultures, if they're certain caste or if they come from a certain background. But we don't have that concept in America. We work with our hands, and that's considered gathering by labor and not gaining dishonest gain.
Well, it was a time when, a working man who got his hands dirty, got his hands greasy by working on a car or farming. These were very honorable things, and God makes work honorable. I remember, again, when I was in theological seminary, I had finished up all my classwork, so I didn't need to go to class, but I had a thesis to write. That sometimes takes an extra year or so, and so I got a job in a factory near the town where we live because I had to have an income, and I would go to work, 8 to 5, just like a factory worker. And we did have a lot of seminary students working in this particular factory near the seminary. It wasn't unusual. And, I can't say I didn't belong there, but, I was an educated man, and I was always seeing things that the factory needed to do better, that maybe an ordinary factory worker might not think about. I mean, I'm not saying I'm so brilliant or anything. So once I saw something that needed to be improved in the business side of the industry, and so in my own spare time, I created about a 5 to 8 page paper on this particular issue and presented it to the management. It was kind of a funny moment, and so the boss, the senior man who owned the company, read the paper and he offered me a job in the front office. But he said, to take the job in the front office, you'll have to commit to working at least 3 years. You'll have to stay with the company at least 3 years. I can't hire you just on a short-term basis. He knew I was a seminary student, and he knew I might actually leave when I got my thesis done, which indeed I did. So I had to turn it down. And I stayed in the factory on the floor working there. And, I could have had a job probably making 3 or 4 times as much, but I just couldn't promise him I would stay 3 years with the company.
But what was the benefit of your staying in the factory? What did you do there every day at lunch?
Well, we had Bible study groups and prayer groups, and it was an unusually large number of Christians that worked there. And they would sit around, we'd get an hour for lunch, and they would gather at little corners of the factory and just eat their bag lunches. And so what I started doing is eating my lunch real quick.
He's very good at that.
Yeah, and I would go over and testify to them. And I was really preaching, and just go stand up, and there'll be a group of 10 over in one corner and a group of 15 in another, with huddling all over the factory for the hour of a break. And I ended up preaching and testifying to all 150, 200 workers in a year just by using my lunch hour to do that. So you can be creative, and the company didn't seem to mind because they did have a lot of Christians that worked there. Now today you might not be able to get away with that in a normal work environment, because this was in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. But one thing Ray did, he invited people to come study a book of the Bible with him sometimes over lunch. And you can certainly ask people if they'd like to study a book of the Bible with you if you have anyway. They
didn't object, but work is a good thing. And this was an unusual company. I would say a third of the laboring workers, the employees, the day workers, hourly wage workers, were Christians out of about 200. And it was a very, very unusual thing. But by laboring and working, you can build up wealth. Then you can turn it around and invest it in a small business, or you can pay your bills, and you can give to the work of the Lord. There are a number of reasons for working. Okay. Let's look at some texts. Well, we already looked at one, admonishing people. We've talked about warning people against not working. That's 2 Thessalonians 3:10. We're also warned in 2 Thessalonians 3:6 and 7 to stay away from lazy people. Let's look at that one real quick. We command you, brethren, in the name of the Lord, you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly, not according to the tradition which we receive from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. And I think he's talking about working and not being idle. It could apply to other things. Not being disorderly. Disorderly in this context, I think, looks at not being gainfully employed. Now, sometimes people lose their jobs, and we've had a brother in our church that lost his job, and he struggled for a couple of years trying to find employment, and he finally did. But he did some schooling. He was an older man when he lost his job, and his company did not treat him right, did not treat him fairly, and laid him off, when he had been there a long time.
When the workforce dwindled a few years back, they didn't have as much work, so they had to lay off somebody. And it's very often more convenient for companies to lay off a worker who's been there a long time, because his salary is higher than people who are new. And so companies began laying off,
abusing their older employees.
Right, and leaving them without retirement and whatnot.
Yeah. So there are situations, and we need to be compassionate with that sort of a case. And we may see more of that as our economy may be in some difficulty in the next few years. We may really see a lot of people struggling. It's particularly hard on the male over the female. Why is that, you think?
Hard to lose.
Why is it harder for a man not to have a job,
Uh,
in your opinion? I have an answer, but I want to hear what you think.
in my opinion, I don't know. Why you tell me, why is it more important for a man?
Well, I think in God's ordained economy, he's ordained that the male, the husband, be the provider primarily.
Well, can we pull back up the Genesis 1
Yeah.
passage?
Yeah.
I think that, or the Genesis 2, sorry, Genesis 2. Is that where, after the fall?
No, after the fall was in Genesis 3,
Yes,
16 and 19.
Sorry. He says to the woman, I'll greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception, and pain you'll bring forth. Your desire shall be for your husband, he shall rule over you. That's the hardship that comes on the woman because of the fall. The hardship that comes on the man is the ground is cursed for your sake, for the man's sake. It was cursed because God wanted man to have to toil in order to eat, and to overcome thorns and thistles in planting and raising stuff. And the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. And so probably what you're getting at is that God ordained for women to give birth and to be the ones largely responsible for the rearing of children. Of course,
It says keepers at home.
That's out of First Thessalonians, isn't it?
Oh.
Yes. Teach them to be keepers at home. Right. Yeah. And then, and man to be the one to provide. Now, it doesn't mean that a woman can't help provide. And certainly if things aren't status quo at home, and things are made difficult for man at home, then it's harder for him to go out. But if a man has confidence that the woman is taking care of the children in a way that brings joy to the family and brings harmony in the family, if a wife is doing that, then he has more liberty going out and going abroad. If it's not that way at home, then the man is very tentative about leaving home. We even discussed this in our book, The Promise of Jonadab, that it's a lot. It means a lot for a man to be able to leave the home on a daily basis and go out into the working world and know that his wife is taking care of the children properly.
I think we sort of, kind of circling the argument. I think in God's economy, he's wired the male or the husband or the man that his self-esteem, his sense of his own worth is tied up in his work more than the female. In other words, men work often outside the family, outside the home, and their sense of achievement and their sense of their own self-esteem or their self-worth is tied up in their contributions to society, to culture, and being able to provide and take care of their family. The woman, her sense of self-esteem, and if you differ with me, you can say that, surrounds her family, being a good mother, taking care of her kids. It's not that she can't work outside the home on some occasions, as you have, but she's more bound by her nature to be a caregiver in the family. I think that part of it's that, and I think that's why it's particularly hard on men when they lose their employment. And this is why we need to be sensitive to men in our churches that lose their jobs, because the churches have to be helping them. And case that we know of, where it was a couple of years before this brother was able to finally get back in the workforce, and he was trying all kinds of things, and it was hard on the family, but he is now back in and doing very well, and has a sense of I think his self-esteem is really much better now that he's working. So I think that's part of what's going on here. God has ordained an order in the family and between male and female.
If I'm not contradicting this at
No.
all, I'm just saying, in addition to this, some of you may know or have heard of Francis Schaeffer, a theologian who had the L'Abri in Switzerland, the shelter it was called. And his wife wrote a book of their life and ministry together. Edith Schaeffer wrote a book called The Tapestry. 600 pages, but well worth every page if you have the opportunity to read it. And in there, she tells of his seminary experience, interestingly enough.
There it is on the left.
He got his seminary experience training. And while he was in seminary, she was a seamstress, a very capable seamstress, and she sewed to have a little income for them while they were in seminary.
You may remember that you sold Tupperware
as
a side job while I was getting my degree. I was bringing some income in. I was actually on the GI Bill and had a part-time job while I was in school. But Gail became a very successful Tupperware saleswoman.
Well, let me just say that the Schaeffers,
back in the 70s.
Right. This was much earlier that the Schaeffers were in school. This was probably in the late 30s, early 40s, maybe even. And she was criticized sharply for sewing in her own home, for making any money. That's pretty ridiculous, in my opinion, because the whole point was they were working together to have this ministry, and his education in seminary was very important to that. And so the point is that husband and wife work together as a team. They're not, off just making money to have their individual professions. They're a team, right? And we see that concept from Proverbs 31. We see it from when Christ told us the husband and wife are one. What God's joined together, let man not put asunder. And he says in Ephesians chapter 5 that the husband and wife, the marriage relationship, is an example of Christ in the church. And so our work and everything we do should be to be as husband and wife. And what's our goal? We often used to sit, we're older now, we don't do many 10-year plans anymore. We hope God gives us 10 years. But we used to sit down and look at our 5-year plan or 10-year plan and our 1-year goal to get to the 5-year plan. And we do that together because we're a unit. We're two different personalities. Anyone who's ever met us knows we're really two different personalities, but we are one in Christ. So
okay, let's take a minute. We talked about the Jamestown experiment. It was clearly set up on a capitalistic model, and the gentry, the upper class, wealthy young men that came, were forced to work. They had to become laborers. They had to hunt. They had to farm, and it was hard. It was a change of lifestyle for them. Let's take a minute and think about what happened at Plymouth in 1620. The Pilgrims came over, and this is not well known, but in their first 2 years, they had communal farming. They actually set up I hate to say a communist system. Now, there wasn't communism in the way we think of it today, but it was communal. And I understand that they were forced to do that by the business, the group that sent them over.
What was that called?
I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. It was probably the same group that sent over
the something company.
Yeah, something company. But anyway,
the London company.
But after 2 years, it had failed because someone wouldn't work. If everybody was farming out of the same plot, some of the men said, well, look, I don't need to work because John's going to work hard and he's going to grow corn for me and my family. And after 2 years, they were starving, and it was a communal socialistic model, and it wasn't working. And they gave it up, broke the land up, and gave every family their own plot. Every family was responsible for their own work, and it revitalized the whole colony.
So understand what he's saying here now. At first they broke the colony up into little groups, almost like, I guess, like a kibbutz in,
No,
in
small,
Israel.
small farm.
Three or four, five, six families would be responsible for one plot to grow your stuff. And when we, as a teacher, I saw this happen often. You get little groups together, and your group is going to get a grade on your project. And so you'd have Johnny sitting in the corner. Today he would be texting his friends or whatnot, and Susie's over in another corner twirling her hair and primping her makeup. And then you have James in the center. He's doing all the work. He's putting all the effort in it. He's trying to get an A. The others aren't worried about whether they'll get an A.
They're going to get the same A he
because
gets.
they're going to get the grade for the project.
So what happens to James? After a while, he says, look, I'm not going to work either. I quit.
So that's what happened at Plymouth, is that everybody expected everybody else to work.
So they broke up the communal plots, and gave every family their own land, and then it began to flourish.
To prosper.
Now let's take a minute. We've got to save some time to talk about how to train our children in work.
But let's get to the Constitution.
Yeah, that's what I want to do next. Bring up the preamble.
All right. This says,
the preamble is the statement at the top of the Constitution that says what the purpose of the Constitution is, the government is for.
Now, Ray and I were raised in a time where every school kid memorized the preamble, the Gettysburg Address. There were several important things that we would memorize, and this was definitely one of those memorized things. And we can say it without looking. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, what is being done today is that we're mixing up the verbs. Now, let me tell you, these framers of the Constitution were, if nothing, precise. They were precise to a fault. When they said we should provide for the common defense, that word provide meant in 1700 what it means today in the 2000s. It means to support,
or pay for,
to provide financially for the common defense, that they would raise army. That was a big issue of the framers of the Constitution, whether they would have a standing army or not, or would the militia provide the defense. But in some measure, the common defense had to be provided for, and then to promote the general welfare. Now, promote today means the same thing it did back then. If you promote a movie, that means you're doing everything you can to get people to come to that movie. You're making it easy for them. You want to be sure that the theater has good air conditioning, comfortable seats. The popcorn's going to be hot. You got plenty of butter to pour on it. But it doesn't mean to pay for the making of the movie. The promoters of the movie are different people who provided the movie. Now, sometimes they work, very often they work in conjunction, but filmmakers are not promoters. And if you've ever written a book, we know that. We wrote a book, but we aren't promoters of it. You hire somebody else to do the promotion for the book. And so this is exactly what it means. It means to make it convenient for the general welfare to flourish. Now, what is welfare? Well, welfare is faring well, or doing well, or being in a state of wellness and health. And so welfare to the framers of the Constitution meant
provide work.
That they would have the wherewithal to provide for themselves and to prosper. And so that's what the United States is supposed to be doing, according to the Constitution, promoting general welfare. We have switched those words, and we think in terms that the government is to provide the general welfare.
But they think by that they mean welfare, handouts,
not enabling someone to do well and prosper. And then we just kind of promote the common defense, do what we can to do it. And so it becomes more and more difficult to get funding for the military. And we end up giving funding to everybody who comes into the United States. And we are providing welfare. Well, the whole meaning of the word welfare then is destroyed, because the people who are on welfare are not enabled to work. Sometimes, as we pointed out before, it is actually better to stay on welfare than to get off of it. You can actually have more to live on if you stay on welfare. And so promoting the general welfare would be more like enabling people to have job fairs, making it easy for people to open job fairs. I know a girl, a lady here in our hometown, who is a very good cook. She wanted to make cookies in her apartment and sell them to people living in her apartment. She couldn't do that unless her oven is used for no other purpose than to bake those cookies. So she gave up the idea. So those are regulations that we put on people to keep them from prospering.
This is one thing the new administration has done, is they've removed a lot of unnecessary, foolish, silly regulations that hamstring businesses, small businesses, so they can't flourish. And this is one reason that we've seen a turnaround in our economy through the current administration. They're removing all these regulations. We actually heard Mick Mulvaney speak at a gathering about.
Tell them who he is.
Yeah, he's the chief of staff for President Trump, and he went into
over OMB, right?
Yeah, he's chief of staff in the White House. He actually went into some detail about how they've studied the unnecessary regulations, and they say you can't add a regulation, the president says, unless he removed 2 or 3 of them. And they've just gone through all these regulations and just removed them. Now, there may be some kinds of regulations that are important and necessary, but the other administration just overdid it, and it was choking business. So it was not promoting the general welfare. The general welfare in this context means promoting a free market, capitalistic society where people can work, earn money, and have a sense of their well-being and not be on welfare as we commonly know it. And certainly the socialistic model will just destroy everything that we work for. And we look at the country of Venezuela today. It was one of the most advanced countries in South America 10 years ago, prosperous 10 years ago, and now it's just a basket case, and several million people are leaving because of socialism has just destroyed their economy.
If I can make a footnote on Mulvaney's speech, he said that the president asked for 2 regulations to be removed for every new one. And he said it was actually more like 17 were removed for every new one. Mm-hmm. So they're really doing a phenomenal job at consolidating the losses on those regulations.
Got to tell you a little story that he told that night. It was absolutely unbelievable. Apparently, there's a young man who he hired, that is Mulvaney, to basically monitor and oversee this part of the administration of removing unnecessary regulations. And he's a graduate of Hillsdale College, and I think he is a product of homeschooling, and just a dynamic young man. And apparently people that get these jobs have to be interviewed personally by the president. So he had to go in and meet the president, and he's a hard guy to interview. I mean, Mulvaney warned the young man, you're going to go in and make your case about what you're going to do with removing regulations from small businesses and corporations to free up our economy and let it roll. And he had real good plans. And so the president was just asking a lot of questions.
But he said the president will stop you within 2 minutes into your plan.
When you make your presentation, you'll get 2 minutes into it, and he'll stop you and start asking you questions. And apparently he's just very good at this. He went 6 minutes without interruption. It was pretty unusual. It was a good thing because the president was fascinated by what he was having to say. And so he So then he stopped him and he said, I can tell, he actually said this to the young man, you feel God's called you to do this. You're really excited about this.
This is what God
This
wants
is
you
what
to
God
do.
wants you to do. This is what President Trump told him. And he said, yes. And he said, well, let me ask you this question. He said, let's think about Tiger Woods, the top of his game when he was winning all the tournaments and was a world celebrity. And if you could trade places with Tiger Woods and become a world celebrity, top of your game, famous, would you do that? And this is his
Instead
answer.
of doing this.
Instead of doing this. And he said, no, Mr. President, if you and I can accomplish what we want to do and what I'm recommending here today and free up American business and cause the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans to grow again, he said Tiger Woods would want to trade places with me. That was just an astounding story to hear. Let's take a minute. We do have a few minutes left. We want to talk about children needing to learn to work in their very early years. You want to say something about that? The need of how do we train our children to work?
Well, as I said at the beginning of the program, children really love to imitate adults. So if they see us sitting on the couch and popping chocolates all day, that's what they'll want to do growing up. If they see us working, they'll want to work. There was a cute story I have when one of our children's chores would early on be to dry the dishes. So that was a fun time for me. I would wash the dishes, the children would dry, and then we'd help put them away together. And one day, one of the children was sitting on the counter because he was too small to be standing on the floor and drying the dishes. And so I would hand him a dish and he'd dry it. And he looked real longingly at the dishwater and he said, I can't wait to be old enough to wash the dishes. Meaning he wouldn't have to dry the dishes then. He'd be old enough to wash. So the idea is we can instill children with a love of work and a job well done. One of the ways is to help them to do chores that they can't do. If you send a child off to do a chore, that's one thing. But if you do it with them, that gives them a whole new look at work. And so early on, when a child's learning to make the bed, why, you just get on one side of the bed and the child's on the other side, and you pull the sheet together, you pull the blanket together, you pull the spread together. These days, we just kind of plop a quilt on top of the bed, and we don't bother with the sheet and all because it takes so much time to make a bed. But it's a real learning experience for a child, just how to make a bed. So we had early on with the children, as soon as they could talk and understand what we're asking them to do, we had a short list. And I would usually start out with about 11, 12, 13, 14 items for them to do. There would be things like brush their teeth, make their bed, read their Bible. Of course, they couldn't read, so I would do that with them. And this is actually straight out of James Dobson's Dare to Discipline, where he recommends that you have a little chart like this. So we had a little weekly chart, and every week we had a little pencil that they would use to check off when they had done things. And at the end of the day, the child would get so many pennies for doing each chore. That's not much, but they're little kids and they love shiny pennies. And so that's how we would get them to do things. If they didn't complete, let's say they had 11, at least 7 of those chores a day, they got no money. And then at the end of the week, they were given the money to spend or to put in the church. We had little banks for that, or to save.
We've got to teach our children chores and little jobs they do around the house in their early years. And if you let your child grow up without that, you may be training a sluggard or a lazy adult. And so they've got to learn work in the home. And one of the areas of learning things in the home is that they will maybe tend to go toward their area of giftedness or talents. And so they learn. It's important for parents to try to help a child find out what they're good at, so that might be what they choose to do as an adult. It's good when your hobby or the thing you enjoy doing can become your work. You really gain. And I think I've seen data that shows 70% of people are not happy in their jobs. They have to work because they've got to pay the bills, but they don't really enjoy their work. Mm-hmm. So a Christian should work toward enjoying and being happy in his work. I know right now the job you're doing, mm-hmm. you say it's one of the best jobs you've ever had.
Yep. It's my dream job. I get to write, which is something I love to do, and so that keeps me entertained all day long. I just love writing, and matter of fact, if I'm in the middle of a piece, I don't like to quit. I like to keep writing.
Today, I remember when I went through high school, we still had shop and mechanics. Every male, every boy had to take shop or mechanics, even if he was going to college. And the girls all took home economics, which meant they were going to have to be being mothers and parents and how to cook and things like that. None of that goes on in any of our schools today.
You can get those courses, but it's like you have to sign up specially for them. It's not something that's given out. But I think this is another good reason for homeschooling. Mm-hmm. When the child is in school 7.5 hours a day, that's where the child's being trained to study. And so we have a lot of people who just want to continue going on studying. Nothing wrong with studying, but it's the only work that they know mm-hmm. is to study. And so when you homeschool a child, you can get through the essentials of the schoolwork in far less time. When you have 20 to 25, 30 children in a classroom, it takes much longer. You have to say, all right, get out your books. You give them 5 minutes for everybody to get out their books and their pencil and paper. Then you have to give them 5 minutes to put those books and pencil and paper away and get out the next book. And then you have to get in a line to go eat lunch, and you have to get in a line to go to recess, mm-hmm. and you have to raise your hand to go to the restroom. I mean, it just takes.
Gail knows this because she's been a homeschool teacher and she's been a Christian school teacher. And what she's saying is that you can get a lot more done in a shorter period of time in a homeschool setting if you're doing a good job than in a regular school setting.
Then there's a lot more time to train them to do chores around the house and other work. There's also more time that way for leisure. One mother said it this way to me years ago. She said, sometimes people working with young people don't realize they need time just to do nothing. She didn't mean to hang out and watch TV or just, she meant time to do nothing, time to stare at a sunset, mm-hmm. time to sit and watch the grass grow, time just to do nothing. But grow and observe the world around them. Mm-hmm. And so school tends to eradicate that time. We give mm-hmm. people the idea that going to school is the sine qua non, that they have to be in school to be profitable. Yeah. Now, while children are in school, that is the ministry God has given them. And whatever we put our hand to do, that is what we should do as unto the Lord.
Sometimes as a homeschool parent, a child will gravitate toward a hobby or a certain thing they enjoy. Let them do that if it's honorable, because that might end up becoming their job or their profession later in life. It's like I said, a hobby can turn into a career if it's a good thing. All right, let's see. I want to hold up one thing. We recommend the old Schoolhouse magazine. Can you bring that up on the screen, Jaron? The old Schoolhouse magazine. They're part of our Christian Education Initiative, very prominent member. And one reason I recommend it is this magazine is extremely practical. They have articles all the time. The Trade magazine for homeschool families. They have a lot of articles about hobbies, work in the home, farming. We know Christian families that are buying small farms and teaching their kids to take care of the chickens or the rabbits. These are things that are work that can help your children grow up to be very productive workers.
And many homeschool families have a trade that the whole family does together. We know one homeschool family, the mother studied chemistry, and so when she was doing certain experiments with her children of a chemistry nature, she taught them to make soap. And now we meet them at homeschool conventions all across the country. They sell their homemade soap, and it's beautiful. Maybe sometime we could even show some of those pretty bars that they make and all sorts of
They've turned it into a
fragrances.
family business. Time has gotten away. We'll stop at this point and see if anybody's got a comment. We haven't left much time for comments or question. Maybe this is a good time to end the program and do that.
But work is honorable. That's the main thing we want to leave with you today.
That's funny. I just had a conversation. I've got this 16-year-old kid working for me now. I'm training him how to produce these shows. And he's actually not a Christian and goes to the secular school. And it's been really, I'm growing a lot. And we had this conversation this morning about work. And he related a story to me about one of his friends. Their generation, 16 years old. And he said, Connor asked him, so do you have a job? Because he's got a job now, right? Working for me. I'm paying him $50 a week, and he's all pumped about it. And he asked his friend, do you have a job? And the kid said, why? Why would I get a job? And that's kind of negative, but that's a testament to the attitude, Why would I? And then I said, yeah, why would you? If you, especially nowadays, we have all this stuff. And so, but like you're pointing out here, well, because we have to. It's part of our makeup.
I mean, I'm sure this kid is just loving what he's learning. I have my granddaughter over, and she is learning every word about sewing that you can imagine. She's learned how to spell selvage, bias, the fold of the fabric, the cross grain of the fabric. She wants to see today how to sew the bias tape on. She's just pumped about learning. Kids love to learn and to work. She's going to actually sew a couple of seams herself today on a piece of clothing. So
that's one thing that homeschooling and to a lesser degree Christian schools can do. We can create a different culture of work. The culture as a whole is just going down the tubes because of laziness and it's breeding all these things. So we've got to work hard at doing our part to rebalance a culture that's turning away.
Oh, and let me tell you something that Ray's mother told me when we were first married. She had Ray. You had an egg. Didn't you sell eggs or paper route?
Yeah, paper route.
She thought every boy should have a paper route and work at a gas station when they were teenagers. Work at a gas station when they were younger. Have a paper route. And today most newspapers don't let children do paper routes. Almost all paper routes are done by car. And our oldest two boys both had paper routes. And working at a gas station, that's putting into practice what they learned in shop a lot of times. So there are things that you can think like that. Well, what can we get kids to do? And for me, babysitting was a big thing when I was a teenager. Girls just babysat. That was real good parent training. You learn things about children.
Okay, let's see. We'll take one more question because we got a little bit of a late start. If anybody's got something else they want to add. And but anyway, it's all about work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a Christian thing to work and to work hard and to teach your children to work.
And we didn't emphasize this so much. Work as unto the Lord.
Yeah.
That's so important. The scriptures teach us that whatsoever your hand finds to do it with all your might as unto the Lord. And we want to be that kind of Christian that people look at us and they see a strong work ethic, not a strong greed ethic.
All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for that you've ordained work. You ordained it before the fall. Adam and Eve were to manage the garden and to name the animals, and you gave them dominion. But even when the fall came and there was a curse put on the land and it made everything more difficult, it's still honorable and godly in your economy that we work hard, and even though we have a more difficult time. So we thank you for that, and we know we can do it to you to build up your people, to give ourselves good discipline and good habits. Help us to train our children to be good workers. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.